Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and in this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night at the local time. And the most important and interesting updates are coming from Kharkiv area. The Russian sources published this night a very interesting video, very long, 3 minutes length video. Let's take a look at most of the parts of the video and discuss this event. The quality is not so good, but the main thing is that the Ukrainians tried to silently concentrate significant number of forces on the borderlands in the vicinity of Graivoron area. If you remember, after the Ukrainians lost Bakhmut on the 21st of May of 2023, the next day they started the sabotage and offensive operation in Belgorod region in Graivoron area. And as a result of those clashes, for 3 or 4 days they were able to hold some foothold in some villages under their control, but later they were forced to fall back. And in the beginning of March, so on the 10th and 11th of March, the Ukrainians were planning to repeat the same story, to enter the Russian territory, to capture a few villages and to hold the area as long as possible. The sources are saying that Ukrainians were planning to use this case to move the media focus from the losses and casualties and bad situation in Ukrainian army, and probably to increase the reputation of the head of Ukrainian army, Syrsky. But the Russians are saying that they managed to discover the concentration of Ukrainian forces, and after that the Russians start bombing and attacking the territory with all types of weapons they have. The Russians attacked the area with Iskander at first, then they launched FABs, then they were Lancet flying above the territory and destroying the abandoned Ukrainian armored vehicles and artillery systems. So as a result of those attacks, as a result of that situation, the Ukrainians lost more than 5 tanks, and we are talking about geolocated, and basically the tanks, armored vehicles that we can see on this video. Obviously the losses are much bigger. So on this video we can calculate 5 tanks, more than 3 armored vehicles, 3 artillery systems, 1 multi-launch rocket system, several pickups and infantry fighting vehicles, more than 70 soldiers losses, and so on. So once again, if we return back to map, the main strikes and the main explosions took place in the vicinity of Tarasovka, in this forest. We can find this forest, we could see this forest in the video, and the main explosions and attacks also took place in the vicinity of Kopiyivka, this village, in this area as well. So if we return back to map, we might say that Ukrainians during the previous days, weeks, managed to concentrate significant number of forces on this direction, and the Ukrainians were planning to enter the Graivoron area and to hold this territory as long as possible. But to understand the situation, it's not just enough to discuss this case, because to get the better picture of the situation, first of all, we need to increase the numbers of updates. First of all, let's say for example from the 1st of March, and if we increase the numbers of this from the 1st of March, we see that the Russians made strikes in the previous days as well. For example, yesterday on the 10th of March, we got the video how the Russians managed to discover another concentration of forces, also in the same area but a little bit to the north. And after the Russians discovered this concentration of forces, they start bombing and attacking this territory with multi-launch rocket systems. And for now we don't have the numbers of Ukrainian losses, but obviously if the Ukrainians were there, some of them were wounded or even killed. In the area of Slavograd, the Russians published another video of multi-launch rocket system strikes against the Ukrainian positions. Another forest belt was under fire. So all these videos confirms that the Russians did have plans, and they did know that Ukrainians were planning to do something. And once again, now when we increase the numbers of updates, we see that the Ukrainians were planning to attack from many directions. Let's say from the northwestern direction, from the southeastern direction, the Ukrainians were planning to attack, and of course along the main road, let's say Velika Pisarevka, Graivoron. And the main purpose of the Ukrainians was to establish control over this territory and to change the focus, let's say from the media, from Ukrainian media, worldwide media, about the Ukrainian, let's say, problems on the line of combat contact. But this is also not the end of the operation, because this attack that failed at the beginning was a secondary attack, and the primary attack of the Russian forces should have taken place not in this area but on Kupiansk direction, in the vicinity of the city, by Russian city by the name of Valukin, this one. If you remember, let's reduce the numbers of days place just for 2 days from the 10th of March. If you remember, just yesterday we were talking about very weird and strange Russian attacks against the forest, against some positions of Ukrainian armed forces with the use of aviation bombs, cluster bombs, RBK 500. And it was a very strange situation to me, and I suggested that something big is going to happen there, and we discussed this video just yesterday. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians probably managed to discover another concentration of Ukrainian forces and how they were bombing this territory with this type of cluster, let's say, aviation bombs. So, as I understand, the attack towards Gravarun area by the Ukrainians, the main purpose of that attack was to force the Russians to send reinforcements reserves to change the focus, to change the media focus. Meanwhile, the main Russian-Ukrainian attack were planning to conduct in direction of the city by the name of Valuki, this one, because Valuki is much more important for the Ukrainians, and if the Ukrainians were able to establish control over this village of Valuki with a very fast, let's say, unexpected attack, then the Ukrainians would be able to completely cut the main supply roads and support of Russian forces that are currently located in the towns like Tavlazhanka, Vilshana, Grigorovka, Liman I, so in the vicinity of Kupiansk, and by cutting off the Russians from the supply, the Ukrainians could establish something like operational encirclement or even something like a cauldron for the Russians in this area. But we see now that Ukrainian plans failed at the beginning, but also the sources are saying that Ukrainians still are planning to continue these operations, but now there is no factor of unexpected, so the Russians see everything, and now we'll see what the Ukrainians are going to do next. Now we're moving to the south Kupiansk direction, where we continue receiving a lot of additional updates of further Russian progress in direction of the village by the name of Terney. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were trying to repel another Russian attack. A significant number of personnel carriers, armored vehicles, tanks were heading along the trees, forests, and along these fields towards Terney. The Ukrainians tried to slow down the Russians, and as a result of artillery strikes, probably they managed to slow them down a little bit, and some Russian personnel carriers moved back. And the same story took place a little bit to the north. Also, the video was published by the Ukrainian sources, another video of how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian forces on this direction. Anyway, based on those videos, we have adjusted the map, and currently the distance between the edge Russian positions in this area, and let's say the first buildings in the village by the name of Terney, is less than 1 kilometer and 300 meters. So very close. The Russians are getting, as we can see, closer and closer. We haven't received anything during the previous night from Ivanovska direction. The clashes, the very heavy clashes, are taking place there. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. As you can see, we have lots of geolocations. The Ukrainians published the videos of, let's say, a significant number of FPV drone strikes in the area with the purpose to slow the Russians down. Furthermore, we haven't received anything from the towns Berdichi, Orlovka, Toninka, but the sources are saying that the clashes in Berdichi are very heavy, and the Ukrainians are sending more and more additional resources and reserves in this area, trying to force the Russians to fall back or at least to stabilize the area. But regarding the, let's say, more or less stable front line, we have report that Ukrainians made a decision to replace the commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and the sources are saying that this replacement is connected with significant number of Abrams tanks destroyed during the previous weeks. On this video, we can see, for example, the 4th Abrams tanks that was destroyed on Berdichi direction. At least the author of this video claims that this is the Abrams. We have two videos from the area. On this video, for example, we can see already destroyed Abrams that can't be fixed or repaired, and let's say a few moments later it was like more or less reliable for further use, but because of the fact that Abrams probably was very far from the line of combat contact, the Russians made a decision to destroy it and not to give the Ukrainians opportunity to replace and fix and then to use this once again. Interesting details continue coming from Krasnogorovka. The Russians published additional video of FAB attack, FAB 1500. So the Russians are in the active phase of storming of the town. Very likely after another week of fabbing the area, the Russians will start the ground operation. Furthermore, the Russian sources are planning this year to start using unmanned armored vehicles. So this is the first unmanned armored vehicle, very big one, that the Russians are planning to use for, let's say, for redeployment of forces, for evacuation, for bringing some reserves, for attacking the Ukrainian positions. So the current personnel carriers, let's say BTR, BMP, will be replaced by this armored vehicle by the name of Zubila. So this is the first, by the way, unmanned armored vehicle. Very interesting. Now we are moving to the south, Donetsk direction. If you remember, yesterday we got updates that the Russians launched an offensive operation in the vicinity of Ugledar, and today we start receiving updates from different mappers confirming that progress, that the Russians managed to, let's say, advance and to get as close as possible to the Kashlygach River and to Prechistovka. And additional interesting reports are coming from Gulay Polya. The area, the town, the stronghold, another stronghold as Orekhov on this direction. During the Ukraine counteroffensive, for some reason, the Ukrainians made a decision not to use this direction, so there was more or less, let's say, calm area. But now the Russians made few attempts to attack, and we have some mappers updated their maps showing Russian progress, and we have the video of Russian attack. Once again, the Russians were using significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, personnel, and soldiers and carriers to bring them as close as possible to the line of combat contact. The Ukrainians tried to slow down the Russians with artillery attacks, with let's say cluster rounds attacks, but all those attempts didn't help the Ukrainians to slow down the Russians. We see the Russians landed the infantry, capture another tree line. So basically the Russians managed to improve their positions along this line, and currently they're getting closer to Chervone, at least from the southeast, and to Malinovka from the southwest. If you ask my opinion, I believe that the main Russian goal is to establish control over Malinovka, because this is a very important area that allows the Russians to continue offensive operation further, and this is like the area that the Russians can get the operational space. Why I'm saying about Malinovka, if we increase the numbers of days since the 1st of January, we're gonna see that the Russians were pretty concentrated in this village during the previous 2.5 months, and mainly the Russians were bombing Malinovka with Lmur missiles. So Lmur is accurate self-navigated missiles. A lot of buildings, a lot of Ukrainian positions were destroyed. If we increase the numbers of days since the beginning, probably of 2023, we might count hundreds of such strikes in this village. So when talking about just activity, fire activity, Malinovka is something like the primary target for the Russians on this direction. So we'll see what is going to be next. Furthermore, the Russians made more attempts to attack Rabotino from the south, additional videos, and we have the geolocated video from the central part of how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian soldiers inside of the central part of the village. For now, we can't tell for sure what is under Russian control, which streets are under Ukrainian control. More attempts we see from the southern part, the Russian armored vehicles crossing the first defense belt, heading to the south part of Rabotino. The Ukrainians show us that they managed to repel some of the Russian attacks. Some personnel carriers were destroyed, armored vehicles were damaged. So the clashes continues, but very likely we need to adjust the map once again. But I think we need to wait a little bit, because this front line is not stable. The front line is not stable. Sometimes in the morning the Russians control the southern part, but by the evening the Ukrainians are able to restore control. Now we're moving to Kherson direction, where interesting situation also continue developing. The Ukrainian sources are planning to start offensive operation towards the landing operations, towards the Kinburn speed, and now to do this, first of all, they need to discover the Russian artillery positions, let's say to conduct successful counter-artillery duel to secure the operation, and after that they will start. So for these purposes, the Ukrainians made something very interesting. They sent a very big barge all along the Dnipro River. It was an armored barge, and the Russians first of all were very surprised when they saw the barge, but at the first seconds they made a very, let's say, right decision not to attack the barge, because first it was important to understand what was this all about. And after the Ukrainians haven't managed to get the results they were planning, they were planning to send the barge and to force the Russian artillery to start bombing the barge with all types of weapons they have. And the barge was armored, so that's why the Ukrainians had chances, tried to get the situation when they discovered most of the Russian artillery positions, and after that to destroy them and suppress. But the Russians made the decision not to attack. They was waiting until the barge, let's say, reached the bank of the river, and then said the boat. The Russians sent the boat with explosive to the barge, and they, let's say, destroyed the barge with the boat with explosive, and the Russians didn't discover their artillery positions. So very interesting situation. So we'll see what is going to be next on this direction as well. Furthermore, we see additional reports of mobilization process in Ukraine. On this video we can see another attempt from the Ukrainian officers, soldiers, to capture and another Ukrainian civilians. Very cruel videos, of course. Some were from Kharkiv. From the western part of Ukraine, we got another video how the Ukrainian police officers and let's say mobilization troopers managed to capture additional men. So the situation is getting worse and worse, and we see that there is no finish to this war, at least when talking about actions. From the other side, we see that Ukrainians have some problems with supply and support, and they made the decision to start mobilizing the monumentos all over the entire Ukraine. There are lots of armored vehicles established as monuments after Afghanistan war and different types of wars. So that's why the Ukrainians made the decision to use these, let's say, armored vehicles with a few things to improve, and then they can use this. And then they can use it for their purposes. Okay, and that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.